I wasn't supposed to see it. My professor, this charming, brilliant man, wasn't just hiding a secret. He was hiding a nightmare. A nightmare so twisted, it shattered everything I thought I knew about him and about myself. You're about to hear a story that still haunts me to this day. A story that began innocently enough, in the warmth of a bustling college classroom. A story about admiration, obsession, and something far more sinister. This man, who could command the attention of a room with just a look, was adored by everyone who met him. But behind those hazel eyes and that disarming smile, there was something dark. Something I wasn't meant to see. Welcome to Eerie Road Tales, where reality twists into shadows and nothing is ever as it seems. Today, I'm pulling back the curtain on a truth I wish I didn't know. It's the story of a man so trusted, so admired, and the double life he hid from us all. And me. I stumbled into the middle of it, blinded by my own feelings and assumptions. By the end of this story, you'll understand why I almost didn't make it out. Why, even now, the thought of what I witnessed chills me to the bone. Some secrets aren't just dangerous, they're deadly. And this is one I'll never forget. This story takes place at King's Head campus, a college tucked away in a quiet, idyllic town. It wasn't a large school, but it had a reputation for being prestigious, a place where tradition and academic rigor came together. The kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. It felt safe, familiar. And yet, what happened there still haunts me. It all began in what seemed like just another semester. I was a sophomore, juggling classes I didn't care much about, but I needed an easy credit to round out my schedule. That's how I ended up in Mr. Fine's English literature class. At first, I didn't expect much. Just another professor, another class. But Mr. Fine wasn't like the other faculty. He was something else entirely. He had this presence about him, the kind of person you couldn't help but notice the second he walked into a room. His voice was smooth and deliberate, the kind that made you lean in, made you want to listen. He had hazel eyes that seemed to look right through you, like he knew every thought you were trying to keep hidden. His wavy, dark hair always seemed perfectly in place, effortlessly framing his face. He dressed impeccably, sharp, clean lines, every detail polished but understated. Even his posture was flawless. There was something about him that drew people in, that made you want his approval. For me, though, it wasn't just admiration. I'll admit it, I had a crush on him. A pretty big one. And I wasn't the only one. Nearly everyone in that class seemed mesmerized by him, hanging on to every word he said. Even the most uninterested students were drawn in by his charisma. But there was one person who stood out among the rest: Jessica. Jessica was one of those girls who always seemed to have everything figured out. She was confident, polished, and knew exactly how to command attention without seeming like she was trying too hard. She had this dyed auburn hair that she was always flipping over her shoulder, a laugh that could turn heads, and an air about her that said she was always the center of the universe. She sat in the front row, smiling just a little too much at his jokes, her pen always poised like she was hanging on to his every syllable. And Mr. Fine? He noticed her. He noticed her a lot. Meanwhile, I stayed in the middle rows, watching, listening, wondering how to stand out. I wasn't like Jessica, and I knew it. But when he handed out our first writing assignment, I saw my chance. The task was simple enough. Write about what you did over the summer. It was supposed to be an easy, no-pressure exercise. I threw myself into it, crafting a story about a wild dog that had terrorized my neighborhood and the brave little mutt that stood up to it. It was dramatic, sure, but I thought it was creative and unique. I wanted to make an impression. I wanted him to notice me. When Mr. Fine asked me to stay after class to talk about my essay, my heart skipped a beat. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd done it. Maybe he'd seen something in my writing, something that set me apart from the rest. As the classroom emptied and it was just the two of us, I sat there, my palms damp, waiting for the praise I was sure was coming. But that wasn't what I got. He placed my paper on the desk in front of me, his hazel eyes fixed on mine, and said the words that felt like a slap. "This is painfully mediocre." He went on, picking apart my story piece by piece. My descriptions, my dialogue, my narrative structure, it was all too contrived, too unrealistic. He said I had potential, but I wasn't living up to it. "You're creative, Abby," he said, "but you're relying too much on fantasy. Write something real, something honest." His words stung, more than I'd care to admit. I left the classroom that day with my paper crumpled in my hand and a knot in my stomach. I was frustrated, embarrassed, but mostly confused. Why was he so harsh? Why did he care so much about what I wrote? That moment lingered with me, turning over in my mind again and again. And instead of letting it go, I found myself watching him more closely, paying attention to his words, his actions, his little habits, trying to figure out what made him tick, and trying, desperately, to win back the approval he'd so bluntly taken away. It wasn't just about the writing anymore. It was about him. Something about Mr. Fine drew me in deeper, made me want to understand him, made me want to prove myself. But as I started to notice more, as I watched the way he interacted with people, especially Jessica, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I wasn't seeing. Something hidden beneath the surface. Something darker. Weeks passed, and something began to gnaw at the edges of my awareness. Mr. Fine and Jessica seemed closer. Closer than any professor and student should be. It started subtly. She'd linger after class, chatting with him in that overly sweet, airy voice she used when she wanted to get her way. He'd smile, that charming, disarming smile that could make you believe anything he said. It wasn't the kind of smile he gave to anyone else. Not to me. Not to the rest of the class. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe it was harmless. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then there were the glances. Shared, fleeting, and far too knowing. The kind of glances that carried secrets. And the way she laughed at his jokes, not just polite or amused, but something deeper. Like she was trying to draw him closer with every giggle. It wasn't long before I saw her sitting at the front of the class, practically glowing under his attention, and I couldn't help but feel that dull ache of jealousy every time their eyes met. Then came the day that made my stomach drop. It was late afternoon, and I had just left a store near campus. The sky was a dull gray, threatening rain, and the streets were quiet. That's when I saw them. Mr. Fine and Jessica, walking side by side. They weren't in a rush, just strolling casually, talking and smiling. His hand brushed against hers, and then, just like that, they were holding hands. I stopped in my tracks, the scene before me playing out like something from a bad dream. They turned a corner, heading into the nicer part of town, and I felt an icy pit form in my stomach. I didn't think. I just followed. They led me to a restaurant I'd only ever seen from the outside, a high-end Italian place with large windows glowing softly with candlelight. Inside, the ambience was warm and intimate, every table adorned with flickering candles and pristine white tablecloths. It wasn't the kind of place you went to discuss classwork. It wasn't the kind of place a professor should be taking a student. I slipped in, staying low-key, and found a seat near the back. My hands were shaking as I picked up the massive menu, using it as a shield while I stole glances at them. They were seated at a table near the center, and it was like they were in their own little world. Mr. Fine leaned in close, his voice low and intimate, and Jessica's face lit up as if every word he said was pure gold. They shared a bottle of wine, the deep red liquid catching the soft glow of the candles as they poured glass after glass. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, his movements deliberate and captivating, and she hung on to every word like it was a secret meant just for her. She laughed, twirling her hair, and he smiled in that way that used to make my heart flutter but now felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I sat there, pretending to read the menu, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Something about it didn't feel right. Jessica looked infatuated, sure. But there was something else, a kind of nervousness in the way she fidgeted with her napkin, the way her laughter sometimes faltered. And Mr. Fine? His charm was there, but it felt more calculated now, more deliberate. Like he was reeling her in, inch by inch. As they finished their meal, I watched him reach across the table and take her hand. Her cheeks flushed as he spoke softly to her, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. My chest tightened. Whatever was happening between them, it wasn't innocent. It couldn't be. When they left the restaurant, I followed at a distance, my heart pounding in my ears. The streets grew darker as we moved away from the well-lit, lively parts of town. Street lamps buzzed faintly, casting long, flickering shadows, and the air grew colder. The sidewalks became cracked, the buildings more weathered, and the atmosphere shifted. They turned a corner, and I nearly froze when I saw where they were headed. A motel. But not just any motel. This place looked like something out of a bad horror movie. The sign flickered weakly, half the letters burnt out. The walls were covered in grime, the paint peeling in jagged strips. A single man sat out front on a plastic chair, wearing a garish floral shirt and sporting a mustache that matched the sleaziness of the entire building. I stopped a few yards away, ducking into the shadows. The man stood as they approached, giving them a nod and a crooked smile as they passed. He didn't ask for a key, didn't even glance at a ledger. It was like he knew them. Like this wasn't the first time they'd been here. I thought about leaving, about turning around and pretending I'd never seen any of it. But I couldn't. The knot in my stomach tightened as I watched them disappear inside. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped forward. The man in the floral shirt spotted me immediately. His smile widened, his teeth uneven and stained. "You lost, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I stammered something about needing to check in, and his smile grew even more unsettling. "You lookin' for Doc Fine?" he asked casually, leaning back in his chair. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Doc Fine," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he said, nodding toward the motel door. "This is his place. Family business. You need something from him." My mind raced. Mr. Fine owned this place? This crumbling, grimy motel? None of it made sense. Why would someone like him, polished, professional, seemingly perfect, have anything to do with a place like this? I hesitated, feeling the weight of the man's gaze. His eyes were sharp, his grin too knowing, and I felt an icy shiver crawl up my spine. "No," I mumbled finally. "I'm just passing through." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Sure you are," he said. "Sure you are." I lingered there for a moment, staring at the door they had disappeared through, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and unease. Something was wrong here. Something was deeply, deeply wrong. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, I was about to find myself right in the middle of it. I stood frozen outside the motel, my mind tangled between fear and curiosity. Every rational part of me screamed to turn around and leave, to forget this night and let it fade into nothing. But the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen, and my legs wouldn't move. I stared at the grimy door they'd walked through, barely noticing the chill settling in the air. And then I heard it, a scream. Sharp, raw, and full of terror. It sliced through the quiet night like a blade. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I was paralyzed, my heart hammering so loud it drowned out every other thought. But the sound came again, louder this time, desperate. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I ran through the motel entrance, the door creaking loudly as I pushed inside. The air hit me like a wall, stale, damp, and thick with the smell of mildew. The dim light from a flickering bulb overhead cast long, distorted shadows on the peeling wallpaper. My shoes stuck slightly to the grimy floor as I hurried forward, the scream still echoing in my ears. The hallway stretched out before me, narrow and suffocating. I moved cautiously, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Doors lined both sides, their numbers faded and scratched. Then, at the very end of the hall, I saw it, a door slightly ajar. The faintest sliver of light leaked out into the dark corridor. My hands trembled as I approached, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I stopped in front of the door, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. Swallowing hard, I raised a hand and knocked softly, then harder. "Jessica!" I called out, my voice shaky and barely audible. No answer. Just silence. Then, muffled through the thin door, I heard a choked cry, weak and broken. Something inside me snapped. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. What I saw on the other side will haunt me for the rest of my life. Jessica was sprawled on the bed, her arms flailing weakly. Mr. Fine was on top of her, shirtless, his hands wrapped tightly around her throat. Her face was swollen and purple, her eyes bloodshot and bulging as she struggled for air. Her nails clawed desperately at his arms, but he didn't flinch. He didn't stop. Time seemed to slow. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the man before me with the professor I thought I knew. This wasn't Mr. Fine. This wasn't the man who smiled warmly and praised Jessica's essays in class. This was something else entirely. A monster. "Stop!" I screamed, but he didn't even glance my way. My hand shot into my pocket, fumbling for the cheap taser I'd started carrying after hearing about a string of campus robberies. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. With shaking fingers, I gripped the device, lunged forward, and jabbed it into his side. The sound of electricity crackling filled the room. Mr. Fine roared in pain, his body jerking as he released Jessica and stumbled back. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, her hands clawing at her neck. I moved to her side, my adrenaline surging, but then I saw him straighten. He turned toward me, and my blood ran cold. His hazel eyes, the ones that once seemed so warm and inviting, were now alight with fury. He didn't look human anymore. His face was twisted in a snarl, and there was something unhinged in the way he stared at me. "You shouldn't have seen this," he said, his voice eerily calm despite the rage burning behind his gaze. I stumbled backward, gripping the taser tightly, my hands trembling. "Stay back," I warned, though my voice wavered. He didn't listen. He took a step toward me, his movements deliberate and predatory. "Abby," he said, almost mockingly, "I've always admired your imagination. But now you've gone and made things complicated." His tone was casual, almost conversational, but his eyes never left mine, and the way he moved closer sent a wave of dread crashing over me. He lunged. Without thinking, I raised the taser and aimed for his face. The prongs connected with his eye, and a burst of light filled the room as the device discharged. He let out an ear-piercing scream, stumbling back and clutching his face. Blood poured from his eye, dripping onto his chest and the dirty motel floor. The sound of his agony was deafening, but I didn't stay to watch. I bolted for the door, my legs shaky but moving as fast as they could. Behind me, his screams echoed through the hallway, filled with rage and pain. The motel seemed darker now, the air heavier, as I raced toward the exit. Jorge, the man in the floral shirt, stood at the front desk, his expression frozen in shock as I burst past him. "What the hell happened?" he called after me, but I didn't answer. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I stumbled outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I kept running, the distant screams still ringing in my ears, my mind unable to process what I had just witnessed. Mr. Fine wasn't just a charming professor. He wasn't just hiding a secret. He was a predator, a monster in every sense of the word. And I had barely escaped him. I stumbled out of the motel, my legs barely carrying me as I fought to steady my breathing. Jorge was still perched in his plastic chair near the entrance. His face a mix of indifference and mild curiosity as I sprinted past him. He didn't say a word, didn't try to stop me, just gave me this faint, knowing grin that made my stomach churn. The air outside was colder than before, biting against my skin as I ran into the dark streets, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that wretched place as possible. The streets were quiet, eerily so, as if the entire town had been abandoned in my absence. Each shadow seemed to lurch toward me, every faint sound setting my nerves on edge. My thoughts raced faster than my legs. What had I just witnessed? What had I just done? Blood was still smeared on my hands from where I'd shoved Mr. Fine, and every time I glanced at it, I felt the nausea rise again. I wiped it on my jeans, but the feeling of it lingered, crawling under my skin like an infestation. When I finally reached my dorm, I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against the cool wood as I tried to catch my breath. The room was dark and quiet, my roommate still out, leaving me alone with the deafening silence and the weight of what had just happened. I sank onto the edge of my bed, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone. The police. I should call the police. It was the logical thing to do. Jessica could still be in danger. But then the doubts crept in, louder and more persistent than the thought of doing the right thing. What was I going to tell them? That I'd followed my professor because I was jealous? That I'd tailed him and another student to a seedy motel and barged in, taser in hand? It sounded absurd even in my own head. And what about Mr. Fine? He could easily twist this into something it wasn't. He had connections, power, charm. I'd seen how he could manipulate people. Who would believe me? I dropped the phone onto my bed, burying my face in my hands. My chest felt tight, my thoughts spinning in endless loops. Jessica. I couldn't stop seeing her face, purple and swollen, the life almost drained from her as his hands squeezed tighter. And then his face. His calm, deliberate words, the terrifying emptiness in his eyes as he looked at me. The memory made my stomach churn again, and I found myself pacing the small room, scratching at my arms just to feel some sense of control. An hour passed. Then 2. My thoughts didn't quiet, but the adrenaline had started to fade, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I sat on the floor, leaning against my bed, staring blankly at the wall. What was I supposed to do now? And then I heard it. A knock. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a thunderclap. My head snapped toward the door, my heart immediately racing again. It couldn't be my roommate. She never knocked. Slowly, I got to my feet, every muscle in my body tensing as I stared at the door. Another knock came, this one slightly firmer. Who is it? I called out, my voice unsteady. It's Jorge, a voice replied, muffled but unmistakable. The keeper. My blood ran cold. I stayed frozen, gripping the back of a chair as if it could somehow protect me. Why was he here? How had he found me? The doc wants to talk, Jorge said, his voice casual, almost bored, as if this were just another part of his routine. My knees nearly gave out. The document. That's what he called Mr. Fine. The same man I had just left bleeding on the floor of that motel room. The same man whose dark, terrifying rage was still burned into my mind. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've got the wrong person." "Come on, don't make this harder than it needs to be," Jorge replied, a hint of impatience creeping into his tone. "The doc just wants to clear the air. That's all." I pressed my back against the door, my mind racing. I hadn't called the police. I hadn't told anyone. How could they have found me so quickly? And what did Mr. Fine want? To apologize? To threaten me? To finish what he'd started? "I already called the cops," I blurted out, the words tumbling out before I could think. "They'll be here any second." The silence on the other side of the door was deafening. For a moment, I thought he'd left, but then Jorge chuckled softly. "You and I both know that's not true, sweetheart," he said. "If you'd called the cops, the doc would already be gone. He's got people watching for that kind of thing, you know." My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. Jorge's voice dropped lower, quieter, almost conspiratorial. "Look, the doc could have run, but he didn't. He wants to stay, to finish his work. And he thinks you might be able to help." Help? My mind reeled at the absurdity of it. Help with what? Whatever twisted thing he was involved in, I wanted no part of it. But deep down, I knew Jorge was right. If I didn't open the door, if I didn't face whatever this was, it wasn't going to end. Mr. Fine wouldn't just let this go. And if Jessica was still in danger, if there was even a chance I could stop him. I took a deep breath, my hand hovering over the lock. My phone was still in my other hand, 911 ready to be dialed. My thumb trembled over the button as I finally spoke. "If you try anything, I'll call the police," I said, my voice firmer now. Jorge's response was immediate. "If the doc tries anything, I'll deal with him myself," he said, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something genuine in his voice. He's not the only one with a say in this. I unlocked the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Slowly, I opened it just a crack, peering out into the dim hallway. There he was, Jorge, his crooked smile gone, replaced by something grim and uneasy. He stood alone, his hands at his sides. "Let's go," he said simply, nodding toward the stairs. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to slam the door and lock it. But I stepped out anyway, the sinking feeling in my gut growing heavier with every step. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have called the police right away, knowing the risks of not being believed? Or would you have run, like I did, unsure of what to do next? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious about how others would handle something so terrifying. And if this story sent a shiver down your spine or left you second-guessing the people around you, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good scare, and subscribe to the channel for more unsettling tales like this one. Because at the end of the day, the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark, they're the ones you think you know. The ones who seem so normal, so trustworthy, so safe. Until they're not. Until next time, stay safe, trust your instincts, and keep your eyes open. You never know who might be watching.